So I'm Stacy Pearson. I'm Vice President for Finance and Administration, and thank you all for coming for the campus budget and financial update. I know there's lots of talk and rumors going around, so I'm going to attempt first to inform and then provide maybe a little bit more detail in some areas. And I can't think of the best way to do questions in terms of whether we do it in the middle or, as I'm going, but maybe I'll just stop every now and then, if that's okay. So this is our update, or what the heck is going on with our budget. I thought the economy was improving. So, you read the market news and it sounds like, oh good, things are getting a little bit better. Well, that is good news that it is improving, and it's certainly good for our graduates, but if you've been around for a while, you also know that our enrollments do tend to flatten when the economy gets good because people go back to work or go to work for the first time, so that's not an unusual. But there are other impacts also that happened in the last year, impacted by years before that too. Let me see. So I'm going to start with fiscal year 14 because we started having some pretty serious discussions after we got our financial statements put together and we were looking at our financial ratios. We have 4 ratios and a combined ratio that when we present our financial statements to the State Board of Education, we review those ratios and what they mean. So it's an indicator of financial health. It isn't the only indicator, but it is ones that we use. So I'm sorry I'm going to have to drag you through some financial information for a little bit. But we did have good news in that our net financial position did increase by $1.9 million. Hi, Marty, I introduced myself. And our total liabilities decreased, and then our foundation endowment increased. But the bad news was that yeah, you do, because you're going to have to answer some questions. The bad news is that our net position significantly decreased from the prior year. So it's a positive situation, but a lot less positive than it was before. And that kind of has to do with how extraordinary FY14, or 13 was, and then how far down FY14 was. So our operating revenues decreased by $1.6 million, and there were multiple things in there. Our enrollments declined for fall and for spring. Now keep in mind, mostly when I talk about enrollments, I'm going to be talking to you about 10th day enrollments. I know our census date is October 15th and March 15th. That's generally, we add dual enrollment, and it's wonderful that we do that. It helps our students get educated and come to the university, but they don't bring in revenue at $65 a credit. So that's why I look at that. Now our operating expenses increased by $11 million that year. So that's a 5% increase. And that was impacted by multiple things. Salaries for new positions. We did invest pretty heavily in e-campus positions, in advancement and other areas. Security, that whole thing that we did with security, and then compliance positions. So all of the titles, Title 9, 4, 6, and all of those things that we need to comply with. In addition, our benefits increased, and mostly enhancements to medical insurance. I don't want to not face these people either. So this is a chart that shows that change between FY13 and 14. So you can see those head counts going down a little and the change in employment going up. So I'm going to walk you just through a couple of these ratios. This combined financial ratio is the combination of 4 other ratios. Like I said, it's an indication of university health. So the orange line is the university combined with the foundation, and that's kind of the national standard that people use. But we also like to measure the university alone, just to see how we're doing along that. And so you can see we were quite strong in 11, 12, and really strong in 13, where we really had built up some reserves and then came down below in fiscal year 14. That 2010 is a bit of an anomaly because that was when the impact kind of coming out of the recession, as well as the transfer of College of Western Idaho. I remember that. So here's some of the key contributors. So we had, in fiscal year 13, we had huge capital appropriations. We had the $10 million for ERB and the Yankee donations. It was pretty significant. And FY14 was much, much lower. And so I went back and looked at the last 6 years. And so FY13 was pretty extraordinary in how high it was, and FY14, how low it was. So, you know, we were tracking along more at the $5 to $6 million level, and we went way up in that 1 year. That 5% increase in personnel expenses that I mentioned, reduction in gifts drawn from the foundation, not in the amount that the foundation raised, but how was the amount that was transferred over. And then that Pell Grant program, when Congress decided no summer Pell, that impacted us. It certainly impacted our students. And then increase in utilities, rent, and other things. So this is the one ratio, the net income from operations. That's a pretty steep drop. That got my attention right there. And that is the impact of a lot of those things that I just discussed. So it's, you know, what they look for in these is a trend. So if that trend were to continue or at least not reverse, that would be of concern. We'd like to have the other trends that we had, but you know, we're a growing institution and we're pretty challenged to do the things that we need to do. So that is one of the impacts. So this was the change in net position. And I've got a note there that talks about restructuring our income and expense streams to acceptable levels. And to kind of, I'll talk a little bit more about the strategic investments that we made that caused the rise in expense and the return that we expect to see on those investments. Now this is a primary reserve ratio. We're pretty good there, and that's because, so the good news is we continue to have strong reserves. Strong reserves are one-time funds that we set aside both for a rainy day and for investments in the future. So that's also a number that our legislature looks at, the unrestricted net assets, and if it gets too high, they get concerned. They haven't been as concerned lately because what we tell them is keeping those reserves helps us when we're out on the bond market. And, you know, since we don't get a lot of state funding for our buildings and we borrow on our revenue bonds, that's pretty important. So what was going on last year then was these investments that I mentioned. So we had eCampus. We have kind of a 5-year plan on eCampus with big investments and big returns. And in fact, I will tell you we're starting to see some of those, but there's always going to be the upfront investment and then whether it pays off or not. And then we also discussed, okay, with these ratios, they're very impacted by expenses. So about mid-year, I talked to the deans and the VPs and said, I really need you to focus on, when you're in the mid-year, you know, everybody's on contract, right? Most of our employees are. You have to focus on your vacant positions. We had to scale back on some mid-year salary increases that we were doing, and we've got some policy revisions for going forward to keep those managed, and then delaying some hires. You know, every little bit helped because we're 80% of our costs are personnel, so that's where you're going to get the biggest difference. Sure, it helps to travel less and cut down on your memberships and operating expenses, but it won't have the impact like vacant positions will. So we looked again at mid-year because we do quarterly accrued-based financial statements, and our net position had improved. Then last year, we got a pretty hefty tuition increase, as well as we had an increase in non-resident enrollments. So that actually helped our tuition revenues. Grant revenue stabilized. It had been down pretty significantly the year before. You know, you're coming off the ARA funding. Don't ask me what that, you remember that ARA funding, those grant funds that they did. American Recovery Act, yeah. And then our auxiliary net income also increased, and our Pell Grant revenue has stabilized. And our salary expense did still increase, but remember in that year we got the increase, or in this current year, we had the 1% salary increase plus the one-time 1%. And then some adjustments in medical. So we're still focusing on that, trying to get through. Now we just ended the third quarter of the fiscal year. Thought I'd give you a look at how our budget looks in terms of our revenue stream. So it's a 10-year look. We were a $251 million organization. We're now a $433 million or so. And the breakdown of those revenues, the smallest increase is in that state general account. So we went from 30% of our revenues for our budget down to about 18. That's not unusual. That's what you're seeing nationally. I actually feel pretty good about the efforts that the legislature has been making, but we're still not up to those levels that we once were. Whereas the tuition revenue is about 2.5 times what it was then. Federal state grants is more than doubled. Federal financial aid has more than doubled. And then, of course, the auxiliaries have done very well also, more than doubled. So that gives you a picture of our revenue streams and how they come in. So now what? What are our plans? So we just got back from our state board meeting. That's why we're having this meeting, because we kind of have to wait till everything gets approved, before we go out and talk a lot about it. So we did have an increase in our state appropriation, about $4.5 million, most of that being in the change in employee compensation. Our estimated tuition revenue increase is $3.6 million. Now, last year, we brought in new revenues over $7 million. So we'll talk about that in a minute. It was the lowest tuition increase in 22 years. So in addition to that, so that's about $7 million, but remember, we have that 3% CEC. We are doing an appropriated budget reduction, which most of you have already probably been involved in. I actually think I have most of the information. So it's about 1% from the academic areas and 3% from the non-academic areas, which is pretty consistent with how we've done budget reductions in the past. We don't do across the board. We try to, think about what needs the most support and all of that. And then we're talking about increasing enrollments, new students, more transfers, retention, e-campus, self-support. So this is a graph of a pretty rapid change, probably around, this is 2006 is the earliest, but maybe early 2000s of our operating budget. So that's not the auxiliaries, not the Pell Grants, not the federal grants. Of our operating budget, the state funded about 75%. And now our students fund about 52% and the state funds about 47%. So that's a pretty rapid change. And it explains a lot of the pressures on tuition. It doesn't explain everything, but when you hear the national debate, that is part of it, is states are no longer providing that support or that level of support. This gives you a picture of just our state general account, which in FY16 will be just shy of $85 million. So we haven't recovered from the FY09 high that went down over the next few years and actually got pretty low. We went down over 20 million. I'm sure y'all remember that year. That was kind of a rough year. So, and we had some pretty large tuition increases to offset it. But we're climbing back up, and that is the good news. So here is a high-level view of our appropriation, what we asked for, about $15.5 million, and what we received, about $4.5 million. And again, we had a much larger ask for salary and benefits, and for Complete College Idaho. Complete College Idaho our request is faculty and staff, mostly advisors, but also support staff. So we've been doing that for a while, because to help meet the state 60% goal in terms of 60% of citizens between the ages of, I forget, 24 and, would have some type of a post-high school degree. So we did get some money out of that, and then replacement funding is one time, and then computer science workforce initiative, we were very successful. We made an ask. The governor's recommendation was half of that, roughly half, and the legislature was so wowed by the presentation that they actually funded the whole request. So that's kind of unusual, but good for us. And enrollment workload adjustment, we got a whole 83,000, but I'll take it because that's probably one position. Now, the news there is the other institutions, probably Idaho, I think, had a decline of almost $1 million, so it was a negative to their appropriation, and Idaho State did also. This is a 3-year rolling average, so we've had negatives too, but those are pretty big ones. And we've noticed in the years that it's negative, the legislature takes it. In the years that it's positive, they haven't really been funding it. And that's what causes our inequity issue, in that we're funded per student a lot less than the other institutions. This is that 60% goal I was talking to you about. So the orange, the nice straight orange line with blue diamonds is the goal for us to achieve our 60%, and our actual results, I guess in this year we were 8% higher than our target. I think that's gonna be harder as we go, so as we see in some of our future slides. As I mentioned, it was the lowest tuition increase as a percent, I think, since I've been here. That's a long time. My records went back to 94, and I might have even been longer. But in terms of a percentage, 3.5, both full and part-time. So we had to make it up somehow, so the non-resident tuition went up 9.3%. And the graduate went up about 9%. Now, we can't really continue that. That's not real sustainable. We're looking at how we compare in rates to other institutions, but it really hasn't impacted the growth in our non-residents. So, we'll continue to look at that. We really needed to do something this year, because that 3%, as I told you, I'm concerned about enrollments, particularly resident. I budgeted for a 1% enrollment decline, so that kind of ate up the new revenue from a budget standpoint of that 3.5% increase. But I'll show you in a little why I thought that was necessary. So the non-resident, graduate, and summer, based on those increases, we're estimating about 3.2 million. So part of that calculation is an estimated 1% growth in non-resident. So it brings in about 3.6 million, but we're really relying heavily on those other populations. So if you look at, if by far a larger percentage of our enrollment is in that undergraduate resident, but the non-resident is growing rapidly, as is the revenue that they bring in. So I know one year when we did an increase, I think this was 2 years ago, they brought in 5 million more than we budgeted, mostly through non-resident. Then the last year it was about 3 million, and this year it's flat because of the impact of our declines. So what we put, the board was very directive this year about what we could fund. They understood the fund shift. The fund shift is, I showed you that graph that says we're 57% funded by tuition revenues and about 48 by 52%, 48% by the state general account. So when they do a CEC and a benefit increase, it's only on those positions that are funded from the state general account. It requires a mandatory tuition increase, and we've said that to the legislature and we've said it to the board, that either you have to cut the CE&C in half, or only some people get the increase, but if we don't get the tuition increase to cover that, we can't do it. So they accepted that as really, they just wanted a pretty minimal. So they took what we asked from the legislature, what wasn't funded, and then what the legislature had approved in terms of the CEC, and gave us enough tuition increase to cover that. There's also money in there for a few things, some general inflation costs, not very much, some library inflation that we need, and then our faculty promotions and stipends, because those aren't part of the CEC salary increase, and then increases in the adjunct rate, as well as new security costs. Because you saw in that request, we asked for funding for additional security costs because they're very real to us, as well as the fact that we're trying to transition to our own campus police, but that was not funded, so that's something that we had to build in because some of those positions had been hired. So why budget for a resident enrollment decrease? If you look at that gray line at the very top, that's our trend, resident undergraduate enrollment. Then if you look at, the yellow line is resident part-time, so it's down a little bit also. And then the blue line is non-resident full-time and non-resident part-time. So that's the trend that I'm looking at. And I don't take a percent of enrollment decline to a percent of budget. It really doesn't match up that way. So what we'll do is watch that trend. And I think right now we're seeing some good news that maybe it won't be down. And that would be excellent, because that would alleviate some of this. But you just can't count on it until that 10th day. And even then, they have to pay the bill eventually. So, and then we budgeted flat graduate enrollment. And again, it isn't a number I just pick out of the sky. We look at all sorts of factors. I talk to the enrollment team a lot. I talk to the provost's office and what people are seeing. So that gives you an idea. So here's the trend in our undergraduate enrollment profile. So the top is purple. That's our seniors. And the yellow is freshmen. So that trend is lots of seniors who we are hoping will graduate and improve that Complete College Idaho, but it does look a little bit worrisome as you look down at the freshman, sophomore, junior. So we're really good at achieving our goal, is what I would say, and that's what we do want to do. So now we've got to come up with some different ideas. This is a new enrollment trend. So basically you take applications, which is the blue line, admit, so those are the students that are admitted from the applications, is the orange line. The matriculation rate then is the ratio there. Am I right about that? That purple line. So how many people who apply accept that and are admitted, right?
How many accepted actually enrolled?
Oh, that is on the enrollment. Okay, because the green line is the enrollment, who actually enrolled. So applied, admitted, enrolled. And again, you see enough of a trend to say, well, it's not jumping up a lot. On the other hand, that enrolled amount isn't significantly down. I pulled this from a Moody's presentation I attended, and it's high school graduates stabilize at lower level for rest of decade. The top green line is the South. So I think people are moving from the Midwest, this orange line, to the South, and in here is the West and the Northeast, and we are the light blue. What that tells me is kind of flat here, high school enrollments, so however that translates into Idaho students coming to higher education. I am concerned about that. I know that with our dual enrollment programs and other things, I hope that helps, but cost to students is a huge factor. So you saw that we got no money from the legislature, no money from tuition revenues. So now we're doing a budget reduction on the appropriated budget. What I intend to do with that money is hold some of it aside to see how enrollments do perform, but reallocate then the rest of it for our strategic needs that's mostly being managed by the provost in terms of that reinvestment. So one of the things that we were faced with, and that line that is for current commencements, we had lots and lots of faculty lines funded on grant funds, and FY16 is the year that lots of them are coming off of those grant funds. So we have a pretty large amount that we need to find funding for, to get them through this year. We've got lots of ideas, going after new grants, funding them on one time, and using some of this reallocation. So I would tell you this, is it's very important that we do that, but it's also something we need to try to slow down on those future year commitments. We kind of have a run rate we have in our calculations that you're gonna do some of that all the time because things just happen throughout the year that you don't budget for. But we're really working that list. We're seeing how many of those commitments we can take off the list, that we can delay, pushing back pretty hard this year. The good news is our reserves can be used for some of that, but you can't live on your reserves for a long time because then you run out and you still have permanent lines. Oops. So program prioritization, how did that play into this budget reduction and the restructuring? I think every area probably managed it differently. I took one that I think I stole a slide from somebody's presentation that just used one example of a realignment from the College of Allied Health, right? College of Allied Health now. And So example, moving university health services from the Division of Student Affairs to the College of Health Sciences. And again, not reflecting on how well of a job people are doing, but what makes sense strategically when you step back and you say, what do we need to do for our students? What do we need to do, to better align? And really everybody's been asked to look at this. And I'll tell you this, you can't look at it all at once. I've kind of had to break mine up, and we have to really focus on one at a time because it's a lot of work. But it's not just moving budget, as this slide says. It's focusing on increased alignment and effectiveness. So the college is reporting not only increased revenues, expenses down, expanded health screening for BSU employees. So what they're also reporting is what are some of the qualitative factors that improved. So rolling out the health screening and wellness programming, the research collaborations with faculty through the health center, and creating teaching collaborations with faculty and basic health courses for students. So again, this isn't just a budgetary exercise. This is stepping back and looking at your organization and thinking, what can we do better? And I think it's been somewhat challenging. So here's mine. The president challenged me when I kept talking about, we gotta reduce our budget and all this. He said, well, why don't you start and give us a good example? So now Max created these slides. So when you see the Avengers here, yeah, so if you see a little bit of marketing in this presentation, then you'll see what I mean. So I looked around at my areas and I said, man, I need to not reduce some budgets in some of these areas because we really have been understaffed. I need, to maybe not do this as an across the board. So I set my sights on Max and I said, we have been increasing your budget every year, all these new things we need to do. I mean, seriously, we know how important IT is and expanded bandwidth and all those things that students like to do. Just an aside, during the tuition and fee meetings with the students, we have 4 student leaders, and we got to the technology fee, and somebody proposed, well, we think we should reduce that increase, and all 4 students said, no, I have wireless clear to my apartment, I love it. So they outvoted us on that issue. So the realignment goals. We were looking, I will say, we looked at some best practices. We're members of a group called the Education Advisory Board, and they did an IT spend realignment study that was pretty comprehensive, and we looked at that. And then Max and his own staff spent a lot of time talking about, how they should realign. We also had something else that we were dealing with, a lot of turnover. The economy's improving, these IT staff get hired away pretty quickly. So we wanted to address that also, and through, I think, a pretty robust student internship program that has worked pretty well for us, as well as developing a career progression path. I know in my areas, I have been concerned about career progression. Who is attracted to come and work at the university? Who sees it as an opportunity for promotion? What about, I would like it to be more robust from people in the departments coming into the central offices and vice versa. So what can we do to enhance that and make a career track? So that's what we've been working on, and improving services, that type of thing. So I don't expect you to understand this. Apparently everybody used to report to Max, but now they're not going to. That's what I gather from that. So, but there's also different functions in there that you can look at when we really do the full presentation. And again, I mentioned career progression, staff reclassification, funding by eliminating some open positions and using some permanent salary savings and allocating some budget to that. Plug in for another power source. Well, here's a I'll let somebody else do that. I'll just say okay. So, not only did I want realignment, but I said, show me the money, and I'm gonna see it, I'm gonna take it. And it's about $450,000, which is a lot. but it was pretty well thought through. The other thing we have is a lot, and I mean a lot of software contracts, so we did a pretty deep dive into those, and we'll keep doing that. And equipment and operating expense reduction. I highlighted the mobile communication agreement reduction because Max proposed an idea to limit the amount of the reimbursement that we provide to employees for that service, because everybody has cell phones and iPads and all of that. So bad news is I thought, well, that's a good idea for the whole university, and we had that discussion. It really can save about $50,000 from what we currently do. The other thing is it was really, really administratively cumbersome. We would require that you fill out the form and the vice president approve it about how much % of your data is work use and how much of your cell, and then it had to be approved, and then somebody had to review your phone bill, and I said, you know, I bet we could actually save more if we didn't do all of that. So we're gonna streamline that with do any of you know about Frevo now, workflow, with the form being on that and maybe a lower level of approval? Again, it's still up to the department manager who is managing the budget if you want to reimburse this or not. I did talk to some of my colleagues, and some of them are eliminating it altogether as a cost-saving measure. So, but we didn't because, you know, we wanted to be sure you answered your emails this year and all of that, so. The other thing we're doing is we were selected by Oracle as a charter partner to implement their finance cloud product. So they're pretty big in the industry in terms of, you know, cloud products in private industry, but in higher ed, you know, they bought the PeopleSoft product. They're pretty new to that. So they're ready to go out and do that. The HR charter member is Rutgers University. So I went out there for a big kickoff, and we talked about that. So going to the cloud is cool, maybe, and maybe you have some concerns about security, which I think some of you who are involved in the campus engagement teams have a lot of information on that. But what I care about, and the only reason I was really willing to go this way, is to reduce costs. And not just costs for the current year. It's hard to reduce costs in an implementation of a new system, but what is the long term? And in our industry, we're just beside ourselves with these upgrades, these very expensive upgrades of, you know, our administrative systems. It's, you know, it's a project that lasts for 6 months to a year and costs a lot. So, and then we have these licensing and maintenance contracts that are pretty high. And as your budget goes up, your number of employees goes up, your number of students goes up, the escalator can be like $400,000 in 1 year. And so I really wanted to try to move away from that. So we would see a pretty significant cost reduction, but then we have to actually subscribe. Some of the cost reductions, there's also enhancements in security, in that they have these big security systems that exist all over the world, and you know, and are pretty rigorous, whereas it's really hard at university campuses to build that kind. And if you've read the news about, you know, some of the data breaches and all of that, it's a big concern. So that's what we're doing this year. So how about giving us some good news and talk about our bright future? Well, I will tell you, there is definitely economic demand for the product that we deliver. You know, when you look at, you know, what types of jobs people need to get and what they need to be trained for, there certainly should be the demand. And we really are low cost when you compare us to others. I think that's why the non-residents, you know, with and without waivers come here, because we have good programs and a nice place to live and pretty low costs. We have a good reputation that extends beyond the football field and debate tournament. We welcome good ideas. I would say be careful with that, because sometime you might have a good idea and then you get told, well, better implement it tomorrow. And we get to work in, these are mine, we get to work in higher education and help change lives and work with great people, which I think we do. So how do we leverage our positives? So we've talked about, and we've been living kind of new and revamped programs. How do we appeal to the community, students, employers? You know, how do we make our value known? How do we keep pushing on that cost side, lowering our costs, and focus on the quality and leveraging the good programs that we have, and especially helping our students succeed. I really believe in that complete college Idaho goal, because When you look at the statistics about getting jobs and the types of jobs and the type of pay, it's pretty important. So, I think this is for all of us to pay attention to, everybody, myself included, about making sure that we make our university accessible to students, help them get here, stay here, graduate, and succeed. So I get it. I can see all of the information. In a lot of cases, it's about money. So we might be touting our low tuition increase, but based on our per capita income in Idaho and other factors, maybe students have already borrowed a lot. We've got to improve that. So we've got a great scholarship campaign going, and we've really got to think about what type of institutional commitment that we can add to that on top of everything else that we need to fund. But I think any survey, whether it be national or the ones that we've conducted, that continues to be an issue, and I think we just really have to be proactive in addressing it. This is what I was talking about, another Moody's slide about the growing earnings disparity. I've seen all sorts of these charts, but it does focus in one direction, that you really need a minimum of at least a 2-year degree, if not a baccalaureate, to have greater earnings potential. There's always exceptions, there always are. Here is the declining unemployment rate for college grads, so that's again a good factor. Those are from Moody's. I got this slide from the enrollment group because the blue line is if we grow at our current rate, I think is what he was projecting, basing on what we're currently doing. The orange line is, I think, 2% enrollment growth and 4% increase in retention. So you can see the significant impact that has. And then our campaign, Extraordinary Times, Extraordinary Opportunities for Scholarships, that began in 2013. I think many faculty and staff contribute to that campaign. I know I do. It's very, very important. And we've raised to date $14.6 million, unless, Laura, you want to update that number? Okay. Well, she did 2 days ago, so that's pretty good. So now I want to talk about the other things that we can do and have been doing. So this slide shows our overall, it's kind of small, increase in credit hours, undergraduate, graduate. So trying to decide which line is which. Oh yeah, this is 13, 14, the top line, and then the following year is the orange line. Down here is the increase in the self-support programs, the increase in their enrollment. And it looks like small numbers, but percentage-wise, nearly an 80% increase in FY14 and nearly an 8% increase last year. So those numbers at 17,000 credit hours can really start to look good. And again, those are monies that come into our local funds, and I'll talk a little bit more about moving to an incentive-based budget where we really want to identify a good use for our reserves that is, hey, you bring us a good program and you're going to go through a rigorous process to show that it will improve enrollments. And looking at Kevin back there, he's already showed me one a couple times. and will improve enrollments and have some metrics that we can measure. And we'd like to invest to give you a couple of years to do that. So we understand we can't just say go do it. We have to help with the resources, but then what program prioritization has brought us is the ability to measure, kind of set up what it is that we're looking for. So that's the number that, the large increase I was referring to. eCampus, online and dual enrollment credit production. So I did say yeah, dual enrollment maybe doesn't bring in the revenues, but it's a very important part of what we do, because that's how students get into the education system in college. So growth in that area, we really, really need to continue to push. And then, of course, the eCampus online. I mentioned that we've made a commitment of about a 5-year investment that really is, a lot of it is instructional designers working with our the company that we're working with to help us market the programs, but to help faculty who want to deliver an online program to come and do that. And again, we have a brand name that we can be proud of, and what the studies have shown is that people who sign up for online programs, you might think they all go to the Harvard and the MIT one, but a lot of them like to align with their institution or with something that they know. So it's another good way to leverage that brand. And same with transfers from community colleges. That should be a real resource for us, not just College of Western Idaho, but the other community colleges in Idaho, as well as beyond our state borders. So here's a picture of our new budget AVP. He won't start until July, but he does have some, I put his picture up there, he does have some experience in both developing and implementing an incentive-based budget model, and he wears a bow tie. So he is currently at Northern Kentucky University, where they actually went through a very, very similar process, including program prioritization. And then he was the budget director for the IT organization in Cornell, whose, I think, budget is as big as our whole university budget. So some other good news is we did just refund some bonds last week. What that means is we have our large debt portfolio, and whenever there's an opportunity to save or lower that debt by 3% or more, we'll usually act on that. And when we go to market, we have to go and visit with Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and they take a look at the whole picture, and their perspective is national higher education, and they have industry specialists in public national higher education. So they reaffirmed our Moody's, our AA3 rating, and Standard & Poor's, our A+ rating, and they do reflect sound market position. So then there again is an asset we have. We're in an urban market, so we have a lot more potential. Comprehensive urban public university with relatively stable enrollment, ability to attract a sizable out-of-state student population, and continued growth of net tuition revenue. Reflects consistent positive operating performance, broad programming, good financial management, revenue diversity, and adequate financial resources. So I put that up there because when you put us up against a lot of the national, what's going on nationally in higher education, they're seeing all of the trends. They know what's going on, and they think that, we're doing a pretty good job. So these are strengths that they mentioned that I referenced before, is that revenue diversity is really important. And you know that, maybe even from your own personal life, is it helps to have other sources of revenue that, help you pay the bills. And then if there's a decline in one, maybe you can offset that with another. And the prudent fiscal stewardship, what that is your leadership getting together and trying to be proactive about when we see trends that we don't like. So I am the first to know, budget cuts are difficult, but if you reverse a trend, it's not a trend yet, but if you reverse some bad signs early in the game, I think it means that it doesn't have to be as drastic in the future, and maybe we can recover from it and keep moving. And then we have a solid market. And then it mentions our strong philanthropic support. I wasn't always seeing that in our rating reports, just so you know. And they mentioned that specifically. They also mentioned our challenges. Recent slight weakening of operating cash flow, less resource growth as we've been spending on strategic investments. By the way, we give them detailed presentations, and it's best to do full disclosure, because if you went to market and said, oh yeah, we decided to build this building, and they hadn't heard of it, they don't like to be surprised. They like to know that you have developed a plan, and every time they come and visit you, you've been consistent with that plan. So I always show them the campus master plan, and remember, we issued bonds for this building and this year, and this building and this year, and that actually counts for a lot, is consistency and stewardship. They're acknowledging our slow net tuition revenue growth and the moderating performance, as well as the budgetary pressures with that softening demand. So they get it, they know what's going on. So here's that master plan I was talking about. Now this is, I think, maybe the last shot of this master plan, because we have a new campus master plan that will go before the state board in June, I think. But I wanted to be sure all of the colored buildings up here are the ones that we've built since 2006 when we started this, like the light blue. And then the circled ones, this is our Alumni and Friends Center, which is in construction if you drive on University. And then we are working on putting together information for our next science building or materials research building, and then that's our fine arts building over there. So those are still on the plan, but like I said, this might be the last time. And then I've numbered down here really all the ones that we've done in this process. It's well over 1.5 million square feet that we've added to this campus in that time period, which does put another stress on the budget, but I think we've done pretty well. I wanted to show you I think that's the right rendering of the Alumni and Friends. I hope it is. I was going through some slides going, well, it's been redesigned. That's going to be really exciting. Kind of a welcoming gate on that other side of campus and places for both our new students and their families to come, as well as our alumni and employees. So we really appreciate the philanthropic, I can't say it anymore, the donations that have gone into this building, and certainly everybody's hard work on that, Laura and her staff and Kevin's staff and everyone. And then this is our exciting move into downtown. It's still a rendering, although I did see that the beams have come out of the ground now. So I tout this as our public-private partnership. There's the auditorium district is involved in funding the conference space and catering kitchen, and the federal government in the transit center that's below the building, which really reduced the cost. Capital City Development Corp for all of the improvements around it, all the land, streetscaping and trees. And then the private is Clearwater and other companies that will go into retail around there. And we are the beneficiary of the very low rates that we were able to negotiate to get into that building, which is really exciting because we will be right down there in the thick of things. We're actually on is it the second and third floor? There is a little bee in there that we tried to show, so right in there. And that's really exciting, except now we've hired a lot of computer science faculty, so we need more money for the finish out, but. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about our CEC. Or should I stop now and take questions? Let's talk about CEC. So we have been tracking through HR our turnover rates and other factors that impact our employees. And we have seen with our classified staff that we are trailing the state, and I mean other state agencies in our classified rates. So when I'm seeing that my employees are leaving for health and welfare, I'm like, what? You don't want to work at the university? Well, it's, the low pay rates. Our compa ratio is trailing that of Lewis Clark State College and Idaho State, and so our turnover rate has been going up pretty rapidly, and the high point was 23%, which is just really, really high. Professional staff turnover rate has increased. I mentioned the IT staff and all of that. It's not as steep as that, but it's still a pretty alarming amount. And even 6% for faculty, because you got to worry about keeping all your good faculty. So we make those requests to the legislature and to our state board. We always have compensation, equity adjustments, and they usually only fund CEC that goes to the entire campus. So they haven't really been real keen on separate initiatives. Maybe they did one year, I can't really remember. So what we did is we took that, there was an increase anyway of the pay line, but we also did an initiative to raise the minimum wage at Boise State from $9 to $10, and a couple other measures that would help bring some of those pay scales up. So in this exercise, there's about 542 classified staff eligible, and 64% will be expected to benefit from these targeted initiatives. And the average increase from these initiatives on classified staff is about slightly less than a 9% increase. So I think they're pretty effective, and the largest one does have the merit factor in it that's included. So then also, that raises the minimum for professional staff, and then pay structure adjustment based on CUPA data of about 2.4. So you can see there's, a portion of the staff of our classified especially, and our staff that will be impacted by that. Then for faculty, the merit increases. So what that does is, you saw in the memo, it leaves a pool of approximately 2.25%. Those classified and professional initiatives were about $1 million, but when you, as I've studied the schedules, they've really more or less covered the increases for those individuals that we just saw that were impacted with pretty nice increases. So the rest of that money, including the vacancies, so we left the vacancies with everybody to do with what they would, but this is unusual in that it is a merit-based only increase. Typically, the state will have a certain percent of it for equity and a certain percent for merit. And in this case, it was to be all merit based on performance evaluations, and they were really strict about that. In fact, we had to implement a faculty number scheme so that they could participate in that. I tried to explain that colleges are very different. They have very rigorous, evaluation tools, but it's based on tenure track and all of this. But they wanted a number, so we're giving them a number. But it does pretty much align with, when you're at the top of the scale, exemplary performance, middle performance, and then just average performance in there. So just to remind, some of the clarifications is the CEC merit increases are applied before the promotional amounts for those who are being promoted to professor or associate professor. It's calculated on both the salary and stipend amounts. I think that was a question before. Then they remain at the same level, which is assistant to associate is 7,000 and associate to professor is 10. And then we also increased the adjunct compensation rates. So this details a little bit more of the initiatives. You probably can't read it, but there was the legislative approved pay scale adjustment, and I just laid out, or HR did for me, how many employees it impacted and the dollar amount, the minimum wage, and the performance-based pay grade placement adjustments. So that is very much based on the employee's performance evaluation. And then the professional staff, the minimum hire is now 35,901 in fiscal year 16. And then that pay grade structure market adjustment from the CUPA data. So I think, 153 impacted employees. I'm out of slides, too bad, but so I had a lot more, but it seemed to get, I basically pulled slides from a lot of presentations that we've done over the last year, as well as some new ones. I appreciate Jim Munger's help on some of the slides that I wanted to, talk about focusing on what's going on with enrollment, because it isn't just somebody needs to go out and recruit new students. It's what we do once we're here and how we help them financially. So I think I see a role for me also in helping us, identify some budget that can go to that effort. One year we took some carry forward funds and just put it all into scholarship. And I'd like to keep doing that, but like I said, I've got a big backload of those commitments to fund, even though we have put some aside for this year for that very purpose. But it needs to be more of a permanent source of funding. We don't really tuition discount, and we always thought, well, you keep your tuition low, you don't need to do that. But we look at, say, the University of Idaho, who heavily discounts. They put $13 million of institutional funds into that. And now we go back to the equity issue. That's because they get so much more funding per student. We had that kind of funding per student. We could also probably put that type of money into scholarships. They're really hurting. Their enrollment is really declining, so they need to do that, as well as I heard an anecdote about somebody going to, their Vandal Week or whatever, and that everybody was out, faculty, staff, and everybody to greet them. So they're really working on that. And I thought, well, let's just not go there. Let's just see what we can do now, to welcome our students and encourage them to stay. Okay, I'll try to answer questions now. And Marty's here, and he might have, Marty, I forgot to ask you if you wanted to talk more about program prioritization or.
Well, they're probably tired of listening. They probably want to ask questions, right?
Yeah, I really do mean about.
I'll just add a couple things. A couple thoughts that came to mind as I was listening. There's a lot of good news. This may go without saying, but I think it needs to be said at this point, because I know we all feel it. We feel like we've advanced as a university in the last decade. We have. So if across America, universities are hurting because states are withdrawing funds. And if you look at what Boise State has done in the face of that, in the last decade, we've through the recession, we've grown our enrollment something like 15 to 20%. We did it, by the way, without any enrollment workload adjustment. In fact, our budgets went down. I think at one point it was down as much as 23% at some point. We're starting to get back on that. And here's the kicker. We've become a research university. When I talk to my colleagues at University of Idaho and Idaho State, they all say a lot of the same things that we do, but they haven't advanced like we have at the same time. And so I think when you think about how did we do that, and I think obviously it starts with some leadership, and Bob Custer's a marketing genius, and he's pushing us all the time. But it's the faculty and staff that have responded to that. I can't explain, there's no other explanation that comes to my mind is strong leadership, good ideas, and faculty and staff responding. So I think we have a lot to be proud of. We're still in good shape. We've got some bumps, but the way I look at it is it's a new business model. I was just downtown this morning listening to there's a Western Provost meeting. We get together once a year, and this year's it's in Boise, and one of the talks was on addressing the value proposition in higher ed, and there was this quote she put up on her screen, and it was this. It really struck me. It says, "You can't price below cost and expect to make it up in volume." You can't price below cost and make it up in volume. Somehow we've bucked that trend a little bit. But if you think about what we've done over the last decade, we've made a lot of investments in this institution, and we've done it in ways that have advanced the quality and the profile of the university. How many millions? 1.5 million new square feet of buildings? I don't know. Over 1.5 million square feet of new buildings. 6 new doctoral programs. We're a bona fide research institution now because we're producing more research. We're bringing more dollars in externally for research. So how did we do that? Well, we raised tuition. Some of it was tuition, some of it was the enrollments help, but remember, if you don't cost your programs properly, you can't get your way out with volume. So programs, we've invested a lot in STEM. Well, it turns out that those aren't actually money makers, right? They cost us money. We built 6 doctoral programs. They cost money. We build lots of buildings. You have to heat them, cool them. You have to staff them. That costs money. So our investments have been outstanding and moved us to where we are today, and we should all be proud that we are there. But they were investments that actually created more cost, not generated revenue. And so we have to think about changing our investment strategy for a while here. And we have to think about, and who does that? That's the faculty, academic side we have to invest in programs that, quite honestly, can generate some general revenue. So even though we've grown programs, if you think about it, what are the programs we've grown? We've grown self-support programs, and we've grown online programs. We haven't been expanding our online programs because it's cheaper to do that. The reason that we've done that is because the state board actually allows us to charge what it costs to deliver those programs. They don't shackle us in the cost. They allow us to charge what the market will bear. So we've added a lot of programs, but we've added programs in these self-support and online. And so when you look at the enrollments being flat over the last 4 years, if you look into the details, as Stacy showed, well, that's actually like, boy, it looked like 15% drop in undergraduate residents. I don't know, that's surprising, but the point is that the programs that generate revenue to the central fund that allow us to do these research things, support a strong music department and so forth, more engineering, those programs enrollments are going down. They're offset by the self-support and online programs, but remember those are self-support and the revenue goes back to those programs. So we just have to think about, in the future, how we're going to invest, and I think we're strategizing about how to invest in new academic programs, because it's the academic side that brings the revenue in. And so we are shifting some monies around. College of Innovation and Design is going to have some programs that I think are going to be popular and revenue generators. So I think we're on the right track. And I just want to say one last thing about this. I consider myself a pretty liberal person. My conservative friends say bleeding liberal, but when it comes to finance, I'm pretty conservative, and I am so glad we have Stacy here, who is keeping an eye on the ball.
Oh, thank you, Marty. I was just going to call you liberal too, but.
So I'll leave it at that. I think we are in a good spot. I think we're staying ahead of the curve with Stacy's help and with the response of faculty and staff and generating new ideas all the time, because that's what it's going to take to become, go to the next level as a university. And I think that I gave a talk to the foundation board yesterday, and what I told them is what I'll tell you, and I think we've made all these great steps forward. There's one piece that we're really lacking still to compete with those national universities, and that is our financial aid. So if you do the math, $3,000 more per student at U of I, 10,000 students, that's $30 million. I applaud them for putting half of that back into scholarships. That's awesome. I wish we could do that. So we're going to keep pushing on that. Anyway, I'd like to take some questions if y'all have any. Comments? Criticisms? All right. Okay, there she is.
Actually, my question is regarding the fee raises. Specifically, one question that is a major concern is from employees who have been here for a period of time. What are we looking at as far as dealing with compression on the pay scale?
That's part of the so we got the 3%, and that was supposed to cover the fund shift, but we had to use some of that to deal with those issues, right?
Right. In the slide on the pay adjustments we'll deal with some of that. It's probably not possible for us to do it all in 1 year, but I think we're going to make a big step forward this year. And I will say, I'm really grateful for the state doing 3%, even though we needed to get a tuition increase, because you can actually make some progress. You might remember back when we were getting salary increases, well, some of you anyway, that every year we did initiatives that would help. We would take a look at where are we really suffering, whether it was in, faculty in a particular college or department or classified staff, and we would try to do an initiative. The problem then is when you don't get that increase over a few years. And then we also had, for classified staff, a policy that limited the hiring range, which, by the way, we're going to change. So that, again, we won't solve this all in 1 year, but we will pay attention to those. I mean, I know one of our initiatives a few years ago was to looking at people who had been in their positions 5 years or longer and making adjustments to those. So we'll continue to look at that and certainly get your concerns to HR. I actually have a list of questions that somebody sent me that I think had that one in it.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Well, here's another one. We really appreciate everyone being here and taking part and engaging with this. Please.
Can you explain the 15, 20, and 25 percentiles?
That is based on their performance rating, whether they will be raised to the 15th, 20, I don't know if I'm explaining this right, I don't know if HR is here, but 15th, 20th, and 25th percentile. So I think it is a rating of 1 on the performance evaluation gets you to a minimum of that 15th. So if you weren't there in your pay range, that's where you would get.
So I think it's 1, 2, and 3 gives you the 15, 20, and 20. So this is about raising the floors, right?
It's, yes, yes, yes. Yeah, the policy range. I'm sorry, and it's a 1, 2, and a 3.
How do the self-supporting programs contribute to the overall revenue of the university?
Oh, that's a good question, Mo. Yeah, well, yeah, we've had that discussion at length, as in what should it support and how much should it be, and we've tried to go in and say what's the true cost of it. We did a pretty extensive analysis of that when we started the administrative service charge for auxiliaries, and looked at what other institutions did and how to measure what you're going to base it on. And so this year, we're up to 7% of their operating expenses that we do. So we tried to apply that model to self-support. The difference primarily is that those programs also need to support the provost's office and any of the areas that maybe that are working on those through extended studies. So it needs to be higher. You know, I'm not in favor of just like, well, we'll just set a rate and do it. I thought we should go ahead and base it on that administrative service charge, have an increase, and now we need to see what it actually generates and what is the effort put forth, because they do need to contribute to the overall university administrative effort.
Yeah, it's a difficult calculation to make. We're probably at 8%, certainly not covering all overhead. It's more complicated than that. It's what do you, how are you paying for all the salaries, and who's directly involved, but who's not directly involved in the program? What's the labor force going into the program? And we probably don't cover all those with the self-support funds. I will give a shout out to Tim Dunnigan and some of his colleagues over in nursing that have self-support programs and really took a hard look at this year. And we moved how many lines? Parts of lines from faculty and staff, and we moved them off appropriated funds, and we put them on self-support funds. Because when we really looked hard, it was like there's pieces of people here and there that we're paying with state dollars, and yet we're saying that they're self-support. And so we're trying to be, all of our self-support programs are a little different. They're a little different in their costs and what the resources that they use from the university are. And so we're trying to systematize that. But my sense is, and Stacy can chime in here, is that the self-support academic programs aren't generating revenue for the general fund. They generate a little bit of overhead, but probably not enough to pay for the overhead. And that's okay. They've benefited the university in other ways by raising the profile and bringing other students to the university, maybe that aren't in that program. But we do need to systematize that a little better.
Yeah, and we've also talked a lot with our colleagues who have done these programs about things like overhead rates, and they've told us about some of their learning experiences, like they made it so lucrative that the faculty didn't want to teach on-premise courses, or, you know, they wanted to do that. So they had suggested certain models of allocation that, and it's not just giving back to the administrative structure, but maybe it's going into supporting eCampus or something that's directly academic. I do think it'll evolve over time because we're not going to see the revenue growth, certainly from the state. I mean, we'll be lucky to get some of the things like we did this year, but it won't cover all of the expenses that we want it to cover. And then that tuition. So even if we have the volume, I don't think we're going to have the capacity to raise general tuition by a lot in the future, because everybody's really recognizing that impact on students coming to school. So we have to find these other ways. Okay, well, I guess we answered every question. You know, I'm gonna, we'll put this presentation on my website and wherever else you want to. And then I know when we went through the recession, we had the ability to ask a question. Well, I guess there's the VPFA email. And you can submit questions to that. The way we did it on the website, though, it was anonymous, so you could ask whatever you wanted. But, and then we would, I know Chris Rosenbaum and I used to just, well, what's the answer? Do we know it or find it? And then we would post that because it was pretty tense around then when we took that big $20 million cut in the appropriation. Were we going to do furloughs? Were we going to do layoffs? And we didn't need to do any of those, but, it was, I think there was a lot of, fear about that. So we just tried to post those. And some of them were really interesting, some of the questions, but, if it helps alleviate, concern, then I want to hear about it and see if we can either dispel the myth or say, yeah, that's the hard truth of it or whatever, so. I'd also invite you, if you ever need me to come and talk to a staff meeting of your college or any of your departments, if you want to, to investigate a little bit more. I like to meet with the students also and talk about what we're doing with tuition. We really wanted to continue on our linear tuition because it's a cost-based model when you're not getting the funding from the state, but I couldn't do it with 3.5% increase, so, but it doesn't mean we're giving up. We just, we'll just continue next year. Okay, well, thank you again for your time and for all that you do for Boise
Thank you,
State.
everybody.